It happens in the late morning, under the great window of the Holy Spirit, where the light falls gold across the apse of St. Peter's. A plain wooden casket rests on the floor before the altar of the chair. There is no eulogy waiting, no applause, no cameras pressing close. There is only an old man in white who walks slowly toward the coffin of another old man, a man he had known and worked beside for years. And as Pope Leo XIV lowers his voice over the body of Cardinal Paul Tscherrig, the cardinals nearest the altar lean in, because what the Pope is saying in this moment was never meant to be a speech for the world. It was meant for one soul, and for God. That is what makes this morning different. Not the spectacle, the intimacy. Before we go further, I want to ask one small thing of you. If stories like this one matter to you, if you believe the quiet deaths of holy men deserve to be remembered, take a second to subscribe and tell me in the comments where you are watching from tonight. I read them. Now let us return to Rome and to the man inside that casket, because almost no one outside the Vatican walls knew who he truly was. His name was Paul Tscherrig. He was 79 years old, and he had spent more than half his life as one of the Catholic Church's most trusted diplomats, the kind of man who shapes history without ever standing in front of it. He was born on the 3rd of February, 1947, in a tiny village in the Swiss Alps called Unterems. His family were mountain farmers. He was the eldest of 8 children. Picture that. A boy rising before dawn in the thin alpine cold, the smell of livestock and wood smoke, snow on the high peaks for half the year. A household where every hand was needed and nothing was wasted. There was nothing in that beginning to suggest that this child would one day stand before kings and presidents, that he would carry the word of the Pope to 4 continents, that he would be buried inside the holiest church in Christendom by the Bishop of Rome himself. But God writes long stories, and he often begins them in small places. The boy felt the call early. He was ordained a priest in 1974 for the Diocese of Sion in his native Switzerland. He was a sharp mind, drawn to study, and he went to Rome and earned a doctorate in canon law at the Pontifical Gregorian University. His thesis was on the idea of the Ecumenical Council, the great gatherings of the Church, going all the way back to the Council of Trent. Even as a young priest, his eyes were fixed on the structure of the universal church, on how the body of Christ holds itself together across nations and centuries. That instinct would define his entire life. In 1978, he entered the diplomatic service of the Holy See. This is a hidden world, and few outside the church understand it. The Vatican is not only a place of prayer, it is also a sovereign presence among the nations, and it sends its priests as ambassadors, called nuncios, to speak for the Pope, to defend the persecuted, to build bridges where there is suspicion, and to be the eyes and heart of Rome in distant lands. It is lonely work, it is patient work, and Paul Tscherrig gave himself to it completely. His first years were spent in the nunciatures of Uganda and Bangladesh, learning the craft. Then he served in the Secretariat of State in Rome through the 1980s and into the mid-90s. And then came the long road of a true nuncio, the road that took him across the whole face of the earth. Understand what that life actually costs a man. A nuncio has no home of his own. He is sent where the Pope needs him, and he goes, leaving behind the language he just learned, the people he just came to love, the streets he had finally memorized. He arrives a stranger in a new land, and just as he begins to belong, the next assignment comes, and he packs again. He grows old this way, in a series of borrowed rooms, far from the Swiss mountains of his boyhood. There is no wife waiting, no children to come home to, no familiar table. There is only the work and the Mass and the quiet faith that this wandering means something to God, even when it means little to the world. That is the kind of obedience most of us could never give. Tscherrig gave it for nearly 50 years. Listen to where this Swiss farmer's son was sent. Burundi, in the heart of Africa, in years of terrible violence. Then the Caribbean, a cluster of small island nations. Then South Korea and Mongolia, the edge of the Asian world. Then the cold Nordic countries of Scandinavia, and then, in 2012, to Argentina. That last assignment matters more than the others, and you will understand why in a moment. Because while Tscherrig was the Pope's ambassador in Argentina, he came to know the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, a humble, sharp-eyed Jesuit named Jorge Mario Bergoglio. The two men worked in the same country, in the same church, in the same difficult years. And then, in 2013, that same Archbishop of Buenos Aires walked out onto the balcony of St. Peter's as Pope Francis. The nuncio had known the future Pope before the world ever did. In 2017, Pope Francis gave Tscherrig one of the most delicate posts in the entire diplomatic corps. He sent him to be the nuncio to Italy and San Marino. Think about what that means. The Pope's ambassador to the very country that surrounds the Vatican, to the Italian bishops, to the politics of Rome itself. And here is the remarkable thing. Tscherrig was the first non-Italian ever to hold that position. A man from a Swiss mountain village, trusted to be the Pope's voice inside Italy. It had never happened before in the long history of the Church. Then, on the 30th of September, 2023, Pope Francis made him a cardinal. He was given a titular church in Rome, as cardinals are, the Church of San Giuseppe in Via Trionfale, St. Joseph on the Way of Triumph. There is something fitting in that name. St. Joseph, the quiet guardian, the man who served without speaking, who protected what was holy and asked for no glory. That was Tscherrig, a guardian, a servant who worked in the shadows so that the light could reach others. He retired from his post as nuncio in 2024, and then, in the spring of 2025, he did one last great thing. When Pope Francis died, the cardinals of the world gathered in the Sistine Chapel for the conclave, locked away from the eyes of all the earth to choose the next successor of Peter. Cardinal Emile Paul Tscherrig was among them. He was an elector. His was one of the voices, one of the votes, in the sacred silence of that room. And the man they chose, the man who emerged onto the balcony in white, was Robert Francis Prevost, Pope Leo XIV. Imagine that old cardinal in the chapel that day. By then, his own diplomatic road was finished. He had handed back his last post the year before. He was an old man among old men, his life's work behind him. And yet here, at the very end, he was given a part in the single most consequential act a churchman can perform, to help choose the man who would shepherd more than 1 billion souls. He cast his vote in the silence under Michelangelo's ceiling, and then he watched the white smoke rise, and he lived to see the new pope walk out into the evening light over the square. It was one of the last great things he would do on this earth. Within a year, he would be the one carried into that same basilica, feet first, in a plain wooden box. So understand the weight of what happens at that funeral. The Pope standing over the casket is in part a Pope this cardinal helped to elect. They are bound together. The dead man helped lift the living man to the chair of Peter, and now the living man bends to bury the dead. That is the story almost no one tells when they speak of Tscherrig's death. The bonds were deep, the history was long, and the grief was real. He died on the 12th of May, 2026. 79 years old, a long life, almost all of it spent serving a church he loved more than his own comfort, his own name, his own rest. 3 days later, on the 15th of May, they brought his body into St. Peter's Basilica. Now, you must understand how the Church buries her cardinals, because it is not like any other funeral. The Mass is celebrated in the apse of the great basilica, at the altar of the chair, beneath that famous golden window, where the dove of the Holy Spirit blazes in stained glass. The casket is set on the bare floor, low, humble, a simple thing of wood. Around it gather the College of Cardinals in red, the bishops, the priests, the faithful, and the rite unfolds in the ancient way, with incense and Latin and the long, slow prayers of a church that has been burying her sons for 2,000 years. And on that morning, it was the Pope himself who came. Pope Leo XIV. He came to preside, he came to preach, and he came to give the final farewell. Here is where we must be honest with each other, you and I. People love to imagine secret words, a whispered confession, a hidden message passed in the dark. But the truth is stranger and more beautiful than any invention. The words Pope Leo spoke that morning were not hidden in the sense of being concealed. They were hidden in the sense that they were never meant to impress anyone. They were not built for a stage. They were spoken over a dead man's body into the quiet of that vast church, and they carried a weight that only the people standing close enough could truly feel. That is the intimacy no camera ever captures. So let me tell you what he actually said. Pope Leo spoke first of hope, and he did not choose that word by accident. Because Cardinal Tscherrig, 30 years before his death, had chosen for himself a motto, 3 Latin words, Spes mea Christus, Christ is my hope. The Cardinal had carried those words on his coat of arms across every continent, through every lonely posting, into every nation where he served. Christ is my hope. And Pope Leo, standing over him, said simply that Christ had been his hope throughout his entire life. The motto was not decoration, it was the truth of the man. Then the Pope spoke of the work, the hidden work. He said that Tscherrig's service had been, in his own words, often inconspicuous, yet diligent and arduous. Think about that phrase. Inconspicuous, unseen. The Pope was honoring exactly the thing the world overlooks, the decades of quiet labor with no applause, the patient building of communion between the local churches and the See of Peter, the bridges raised in silence between peoples who did not trust one another. The Pope said the Cardinal had worked with patience and self-sacrifice to foster concord among the nations. That is the eulogy of a man who spent himself for others and asked for nothing back. And then Pope Leo turned to the hardest thing of all, death itself. He reached for the words of Jesus standing before the tomb of Lazarus. He recalled the scene from the Gospel of John when Martha comes to the Lord grieving, and Jesus says to her, "Your brother will rise." And then those words that the whole church leans on when the dark closes in, "I am the resurrection and the life." The Pope placed the Cardinal's death inside that promise. He said that the ultimate foundation of all our hope lies beyond history and is rooted in the resurrection of Christ, beyond history, beyond the reach of death. That is where he set the soul of Emil Paul Tscherrig. These were not academic words. This was one old shepherd commending another into the hands of God and meaning every syllable. And then came the part that breaks the heart of anyone who has ever stood at a grave. When the Mass is ended, the Pope does the rite called the final commendation and farewell. He moves to the casket. He takes the holy water and sprinkles it over the wood, the same water of baptism, the water that began the Cardinal's Christian life, now closing it. Then he takes the incense, and the smoke rises around the coffin, the prayers of the Church ascending with it. And in the old prayers of that rite, the Church begs the angels and the saints to come and meet this soul, to lead him into the holy city, into the New Jerusalem, into the light that has no evening. That is the moment no one was meant to merely watch. It is a moment meant to be felt. A pope, bent over the body of a friend and a fellow servant, asking heaven to open its gates. There is nothing performed in it. There is only faith, raw and ancient, doing the only thing faith can do in the face of death. Trusting, pleading, believing. And I think that is what shook the people who stood close enough that morning. Not a secret. The opposite of a secret. The plain, unguarded sight of the most powerful religious leader on earth, made small and tender by grief and hope. The man in white was not performing a duty. He was burying a brother. Now let me ask you something. You who are listening to this alone, perhaps late at night, perhaps with the phone glowing in a dark room, what will be your motto when your hour comes? What 3 words will the people who love you carry to your grave? Cardinal Tscherrig chose his 30 years before he needed them. Christ is my hope. And when the moment finally came, when the long road from a Swiss mountain farm to the floor of St. Peter's reached its end, those words were still true. He had not outgrown them. He had not been disappointed by them. The Pope stood over him and confirmed it before God and the whole Church. This man's hope was Christ, and it did not fail him. That is the lesson hidden inside this funeral, and it is the only lesson that finally matters. We spend our lives chasing things that cannot follow us past the grave: titles, comfort, the good opinion of strangers. Tscherrig held some of the highest titles his church could give, and yet he was buried in a plain wooden box on a bare floor, the same as any beggar, because in the end the church teaches that we are all the same before God. The diplomat who counseled presidents and the farmer who never left his village will both stand naked before the same merciful judge. So the question is not how high you climbed. The question is what you held onto when you fell. Cardinal Tscherrig held onto Christ. And so, when his body lay before that golden window, and the incense rose, and the Pope whispered the ancient prayers, there was sorrow in the room, yes, but there was no despair, because a man who dies with Christ as his hope does not vanish into nothing. The Church does not believe that. The Church has never believed that. We believe that the soul of Emil Paul Tscherrig, the boy from Unterems, the priest, the nuncio, the cardinal, was carried up beyond history into the light that does not end. Your brother will rise. That is what the Lord said to Martha. That is what he says over every faithful grave. That is what he says over the one who is waiting for you. Pope Leo XIV turned from the casket when the rite was done. The cardinals filed out in their red. The great doors of the basilica stood open to the Roman morning, and the world moved on, as the world always does, barely noticing that one of its quiet giants had been laid to rest. But you noticed, you stayed, you listened to the whole of it, and maybe that is the point of telling this story at all. Not so that we can pretend we overheard a secret, but so that we can remember a truth the world is desperate to forget, that death is real, and it is coming for all of us, and the only thing that will matter on that morning is the one we chose to hope in. Cardinal Tscherrig chose well. He chose Christ. 30 years before the end, he wrote it on his shield, and he never took it back. So tonight, before you sleep, before you set down the phone and let the dark take the room, ask yourself the only question that ever truly counts. When they carry you to the altar, when the water falls and the incense rises, and someone you love whispers a prayer over the wood, what will your hope have been? Choose it now. Choose it while there is still time. Choose it the way the old cardinal did, so that when your own hour comes, the words will still be true. Christ is my hope. May Cardinal Emil Paul Tscherrig rest in the peace of the Lord he served, and may we, when our time comes, be found holding the same hope he held to the very end.